It's October 14, 1942. Stalingrad Senior Sergeant Viktor Reznov crouched in the skeletal remains of what had once been someone's home, his breath forming tiny clouds of vapor in the frozen air. Through the shattered window frame, the city stretched before him like the carcass of some enormous beast, gutted and left to rot. Smoke hung perpetually in the air, thick enough to taste, turning daylight into a grey twilight that never quite lifted. He pressed his eye against the scope, mounted on his Mosin Nagant rifle, adjusting the strange amber-tinted lens that had been fitted over the standard optic. The glass caught the dim light filtering through the haze, casting a faint golden glow across his weathered face. Through this peculiar filter the world transformed. Shapes that should have been invisible against the smoke and shadow suddenly revealed themselves, edges sharpened, contrasts deepened. 300 meters away, moving between the ruins of a collapsed factory, German reconnaissance scouts advanced with practiced caution. "You're still using that cursed thing," whispered Corporal Dmitry Volkov, his spotter pressed against the adjacent wall. His voice carried an edge that went beyond simple tactical concern. Reznov didn't respond immediately. He watched the Germans move, counting them silently. 7 men. Light equipment. Forward observers, probably, mapping Soviet positions before a larger assault. Through the amber lens they appeared almost ethereal, ghostly silhouettes against the perpetual smoke, as if the glass revealed not just their positions, but something deeper, something closer to truth. 3 men died retrieving that lens, Volkov continued, his tone more insistent now. Konstantin touched it first. "Dead 2 days later, sniper round through the throat." Then Grigorovich took it from his body. Shelling got him that same night. And Pavlov, he only looked through it once, swore he could see things that weren't there. Walked off a roof the next morning. Pavlov was drunk, Reznov said quietly, his eye never leaving the scope, and the other 2 were in Stalingrad. "Men die here. That's what this place does. Not like that. Not that fast. Not all 3. Volkov's fingers tightened around his binoculars. "The other snipers won't work with you anymore. They say the lens carries something with it, something from whoever wore it last." Through the amber glass, Reznov tracked the lead German scout as he paused to signal his team forward. The man's movements were confident, efficient, the bearing of a veteran who'd seen combat on multiple fronts. For just a moment, Reznov felt something strange, a flicker at the edge of his vision, as if the lens was showing him not just where the man was, but where he would be. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and watched through the scope as the German scout dropped silently into the rubble. Before the others could react, Reznov worked the bolt, the metallic snap sharp in the confined space, and fired again. Then again. 3 shots, 3 bodies, and the remaining Germans scattered like startled crows, disappearing back into the smoke from which they'd emerged. "They'll know we're here now," Volkov muttered, already packing their equipment. "We need to move." But Reznov remained still for a moment longer, the amber lens still pressed against his eye, scanning the ruins where the Germans had vanished. The glass seemed to glow faintly in his hands, warm despite the cold, and for just a heartbeat, he thought he saw shapes moving in the smoke, shapes that didn't correspond to any living thing. He blinked hard and pulled away from the scope. When he looked again through normal vision, there was nothing but empty ruins and drifting ash. Before the war, before Stalingrad became a word synonymous with slaughter, Viktor Reznov had been a different man living a different life. He was born in 1916 in a small village on the western slopes of the Ural Mountains, where winter arrived in October and didn't release its grip until May, where the forests stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, dark and deep and older than memory. His father, Alexei Reznov, served as a forest warden, responsible for protecting the state's timber resources and managing the wildlife populations that sustained the local communities. It was solitary work, often requiring weeks alone in the wilderness, tracking wolf packs that threatened livestock or hunting down poachers who operated in the remote valleys where the state's authority barely reached. Victor learned to hunt before he learned to read. By age 8, he could track a deer through fresh snow, reading the story of its passage in the depth of prints, the spacing of steps, the places where it had paused to feed or sense danger. By 10, he could shoot a running hare at 50 meters with his father's old bolt-action rifle, leading the target instinctively, his body understanding the mathematics of ballistics before his mind could articulate them. But his father taught him something more important than marksmanship. He taught him patience, how to remain motionless in a snowblind for hours, becoming part of the landscape, letting the forest forget you existed. How to read the quality of silence, distinguishing between the quiet of an empty forest and the stillness that comes when predators move through. How to kill cleanly, quickly, with respect for the life being taken. Death is not the enemy, his father told him once, gutting a wolf they'd tracked for 3 days after it had killed a farmer's sheep. Death is simply the end of a story. Every creature's story. The sin is not in killing, but in killing without purpose, without respect, without understanding what you take from the world. Victor carried those words with him when, in the spring of 1938, he received his conscription notice. He reported to the recruitment center in Sverdlovsk, where a board clerk took one look at his background and stamped his papers for infantry training. He served his mandatory 2 years in a rifle division stationed near the Finnish border, learned the rituals and routines of military life, and was released back to civilian life in 1940 with the rank of junior sergeant and little expectation that he'd ever wear a uniform again. He returned to the forests. For 18 months he lived the life his father had lived, alone among the trees for weeks at a time, hunting and tracking and watching the seasons turn. It was a hard life but an honest one, governed by rules that made sense, where skill and patience brought results, where a man could see the direct consequences of his choices. Then, on June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the world Victor knew began to die. The announcement came over the radio in the village's only cafe, Molotov's voice crackling through static, speaking of treacherous attacks and the nation's sacred duty. Victor sat in silence drinking weak tea, watching the faces of the men around him drain of color as they understood what was coming. He didn't wait for another conscription notice. He volunteered the next day, not because he believed in the speeches about defending the motherland or destroying fascism, but because hunting men felt like the only skill he had that mattered anymore. The world had become a place where the old rules no longer applied, where the patience and respect his father had taught him seemed almost quaint. But the fundamental skill, seeing what others couldn't see, moving when others stayed still, taking life from a distance, that remained valuable. That might be the only thing that helped him survive what was coming. He returned to military service as a senior sergeant, assigned to a rifle division being formed near Moscow. His hunting experience marked him immediately for sniper training. By October 1941, he was stalking German officers through the frozen forests west of the capital, recording his first confirmed kills. By January he had 17. He killed methodically, without passion or hatred, simply executing the task assigned to him with the same focused patience he'd once used to track wolves. Each shot was clean, each death as quick as he could make it. He tried to maintain the principles his father had taught him, that death should have purpose, should be delivered with respect. But in the chaos and slaughter of the Eastern Front, those principles became harder to hold on to. He was no longer hunting wolves that threatened livestock. He was killing men, and those men were trying to kill him, and the reasons why seemed to matter less with each passing week. When his division received orders to reinforce Stalingrad in September 1942, Victor had 43 confirmed kills and a growing reputation as one of the regiment's most effective snipers. He arrived believing that war was simply hunting on a larger scale, that the skills that had sustained him in the Ural forests would sustain him in the ruined city. He learned very quickly that Stalingrad was something else entirely. It wasn't a hunt. It was a descent into a kind of hell he hadn't known existed, where the normal rules of life and death seemed to have been suspended, where men fought over piles of rubble that had once been homes, where every wall might hide a sniper and every shadow might conceal a mine. This was a place where the old certainties meant nothing, where survival required becoming something his father would not have recognized. And it was in this place, among these ruins, that Viktor Reznov would find the amber lens and discover just how much of himself he was willing to sacrifice to stay alive. The lens came to them on the night of October 8th, carried back from a raid that had gone catastrophically wrong. A platoon-strength assault on a German observation post had been ambushed, cut to pieces by machine gun fire from positions the Soviet intelligence had sworn were unoccupied. Of the 43 men who'd gone out into the darkness, 11 returned, dragging their wounded and leaving their dead behind. Among the few items salvaged from the operation was a leather case, torn from the body of a German reconnaissance officer who'd been killed in the initial exchange. Inside the case was a modified scope, a Zeiss optic that had been fitted with an unusual amber-colored filter. The glass itself was of exceptional quality, the kind of precision instrument that spoke of specialized manufacture, but it was the filter that drew immediate attention. It was colored a deep golden amber, like honey held up to sunlight, and it had been fixed over the objective lens with meticulous care. Strange markings were etched into the metal housing, symbols that none of the Russian soldiers could identify. In certain light, the glass seemed to glow faintly, as if it held its own internal illumination. The soldier who'd retrieved it, a young private named Konstantin Volkov, had been excited by the find. German optics were prized trophies, often of far higher quality than Soviet equivalents, and a specialized scope like this could be valuable, either for use or for barter. He'd claimed it immediately, mounting it on his own rifle, eager to test what advantages it might provide. He was dead within 48 hours, shot through the throat by a German sniper while occupying a position he'd used successfully for days. The shot had come at dawn, through smoke so thick that visibility was measured in meters. It should have been impossible. Yet the German shooter had placed the round with surgical precision, as if the smoke didn't exist. The scope passed to Sergeant Grigorovich, an experienced sniper who'd survived since the battle's beginning. He'd been more cautious, testing the optic carefully, and had reported something unusual. The amber filter seemed to enhance contrast dramatically, allowing him to distinguish shapes and movement through the perpetual haze that blanketed the city. Through normal glass, the smoke and dust rendered anything beyond 100 meters into indistinct gray blur. Through the amber lens, edges sharpened. Shadows gained definition. It was as if the smoke became transparent. Grigorovich used the scope for exactly 1 day. That night, a German artillery barrage demolished the building he'd been using as a hide, killing him and 2 other soldiers instantly. Pure chance, perhaps. Stalingrad was a city where artillery fell randomly and constantly, where death arrived without warning or pattern. But the coincidence was noted. The third man to claim the scope was Corporal Pavlov, a sniper known for his steady nerves and dark humor. He'd mounted the optic on his rifle that evening and spent an hour looking through it, scanning the ruins, testing its capabilities. When he finally lowered the rifle, his hands were shaking. "There's something wrong with it," he told the others gathered in the basement they were using for shelter. "I can see things through it. Things that aren't there, shapes moving in the smoke, figures standing in places where there's nothing but empty air." The other soldiers had laughed nervously, suggesting he was tired, that the constant stress was making him see phantoms. Pavlov had insisted. He'd removed the scope from his rifle, placed it carefully back in its case, and said he wanted nothing more to do with it. The next morning, Pavlov walked off the roof of a 4-story building. The official report called it accidental, a man disoriented by exhaustion taking a wrong step. but he'd been found on the ground with his eyes open, staring upward, and those who saw his face before they covered it said his expression wasn't one of surprise or fear, but of recognition, as if he'd seen something he'd been expecting. After that, no one wanted the scope. It sat in its case for 3 days, avoided like a contaminated thing, while rumors circulated about German occult research, about SS scientists developing supernatural weapons, about cursed objects that carried death with them. The rumors grew more elaborate with each telling. The scope had been blessed by Nazi mystics. It had been coated with chemicals derived from Jewish blood. It allowed the user to see through walls, but slowly drove them mad. It was a trap, left deliberately for Soviet soldiers to find, designed to destroy them from within. When Viktor Reznov first examined the scope, he did so with the skepticism of a man raised in forests rather than cities, a man who'd learned to distinguish between the things that killed you and the stories people told about them. Wolves were dangerous. Exposure was dangerous. Hunger was dangerous. Superstition was a luxury for people who didn't have real threats to worry about. He took the scope from its case in the dim light of their shelter, ignoring the uneasy glances from the other soldiers. He examined the amber filter carefully, noting the quality of the glass, the precision of its mounting, the strange etchings on the housing. Then, methodically, he disassembled the scope, checking each component for damage or tampering, searching for any rational explanation for the deaths that had followed it. What he found was simply excellent German engineering. The filter appeared to be made from glass that had been treated with some kind of chemical coating, something that absorbed certain wavelengths of light while allowing others to pass through. The effect was to dramatically enhance contrast in low light and smoky conditions, making the optic exceptionally effective in exactly the kind of environment that defined Stalingrad's perpetual haze. As for the markings on the housing, they were manufacturer's marks, calibration notations, serial numbers, nothing mystical, nothing sinister, just the kind of technical specifications that would be expected on a piece of precision optical equipment. "It's just glass," Reznov said to Volkov, who watched him with unconcealed unease. "Good glass, treated with something that helps it cut through smoke." "That's all? Then why did 3 men die?" "3 men died because we're in Stalingrad. Men die here every day, every hour." Reznov reassembled the scope carefully, his movements precise. "Konstantin was killed by a German sniper. Grigorovich was killed by artillery. Pavlov walked off a roof. None of that has anything to do with a piece of glass. Pavlov saw things through it. Things that weren't there. Pavlov was exhausted, probably hadn't slept properly in days. The mind does strange things when it's pushed too far." Reznov mounted the scope on his own rifle, ignoring Volkov's sharp intake of breath. "I'm going to test it tonight. If it works the way I think it does, it could give us a significant advantage." That night, alone on the 3rd floor of a partially collapsed apartment building, Reznov looked through the amber lens for the first time. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The smoke that normally reduced visibility to grey obscurity became somehow transparent, as if he was seeing through it rather than into it. Shapes that should have been invisible revealed themselves, edges sharp and clear. A German soldier, standing watch 200 meters away in what he believed was complete concealment, appeared through the amber glass as distinctly as if the air was crystal clear. Reznov watched for an hour, scanning the ruins, testing the limits of the optics enhancement. It was extraordinary. With this scope, darkness and smoke ceased to be the barriers they'd always been. He could engage targets that other snipers couldn't even see. He could operate in conditions that normally made accurate fire impossible. He did notice something strange. Occasionally, at the very edge of his vision, he thought he caught glimpses of movement that didn't correspond to anything real, flickering shadows that vanished when he tried to focus on them. But he attributed this to eye strain, to the way prolonged observation through any optic could create false patterns. the mind trying to make sense of ambiguous visual information. When dawn came, he packed his rifle and returned to the shelter. Volkov was awake, waiting for him with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. "Well?" the corporal asked. "It works," Reznov said simply. "It works extraordinarily well. Better than any optic I've ever used. And the other thing, the things Pavlov saw?" Reznov shrugged. "I saw smoke and ruins and Germans. Nothing more, but that wasn't entirely true. He had seen something else, something he couldn't quite articulate. Looking through the amber lens, the world had felt different somehow. Clearer, yes, but also stranger, as if the filter revealed not just shapes but some underlying pattern beneath the chaos. And once or twice, he could have sworn that the lens had shown him not just where targets were, but where they were going to be, their future positions flickering into visibility a heartbeat before they moved into them. He told himself it was simply exceptional situational awareness, his hunter's instincts enhanced by superior optics. He told himself the lens was just a tool, no different from any other piece of equipment, effective because of chemistry and engineering rather than any supernatural property. He almost believed it. For 2 weeks, Viktor Reznov hunted with the amber lens, and the Germans began to die. He worked alone now without a spotter. Volkov had requested reassignment after the 3rd night, claiming he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them whenever Reznov used the cursed scope. The other soldiers avoided him. Even his commanding officer, Captain Andreev, seemed uneasy in his presence, though the captain couldn't argue with results. Reznov's kill count climbed steadily. In 14 days, he eliminated 31 confirmed targets. German scouts, officers, machine gunners, anyone foolish enough to move through the ruins during the hours when smoke and shadow should have provided concealment. His technique was simple and devastatingly effective. He would position himself in buildings the Germans thought were abandoned, wait motionless for hours, and then, when enemy reconnaissance teams moved forward, under cover of the perpetual haze, he would eliminate them with surgical precision. The amber lens made it almost effortless. Through the treated glass, Germans who believed themselves invisible appeared clearly, their movements tracked with perfect clarity regardless of smoke density or lighting conditions. Reznov would watch them advance, select his targets methodically, and drop them one by one before they even understood where the shots were coming from. The psychological effect on the German forces was profound. Intelligence reports, intercepted from captured communications, revealed growing paranoia among enemy units operating in Reznov's sector. German soldiers spoke of a demon sniper, an invisible shooter who could see through smoke and darkness, who killed without warning from positions that should have been impossible. Some claimed he could see through walls. Others insisted he knew their positions before they even moved into them. The rumors grew with each death, fear spreading like infection through the German ranks. Patrols in Reznov's sector became cautious to the point of paralysis. Officers refused to conduct reconnaissance during hours of limited visibility. Entire units demanded transfers to different sectors, preferring to face conventional dangers rather than the unseen killer who seemed to possess supernatural perception. But there was a cost. Reznov began to notice changes in himself. Small things at first. Difficulty sleeping. When he closed his eyes, he saw the amber-tinted world of the lens, as if his vision had been permanently filtered. He found himself seeing patterns in random chaos, detecting meaning in coincidence, feeling as if he could predict enemy movements not through tactical analysis, but through some deeper intuition that he couldn't explain or control. And the shapes at the edge of his vision became more frequent, not just when looking through the scope now, but sometimes even with normal sight. Flickering shadows that moved wrongly, figures standing in ruins that, when he turned to look directly, proved to be empty air and crumbling stone. He heard sounds that no one else heard, whispers in German carried on wind that wasn't blowing, voices speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but that nevertheless filled him with inexplicable dread. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself it was the stress of constant combat, of living in ruins where death arrived randomly and without warning. He told himself every soldier in Stalingrad experienced these symptoms, that the city itself drove men toward madness regardless of what tools they used. But deep down, in a place he refused to examine too closely, he suspected something else was happening. The lens wasn't just helping him see, it was changing him, altering his perception in ways that went beyond simple optical enhancement. And the longer he used it, the more difficult it became to distinguish between what was real and what the amber glass was showing him. Other snipers refused to work with him now. They crossed themselves when he passed, made signs against evil, whispered that he'd made some kind of bargain with dark forces. His isolation became complete. He operated alone, slept alone, ate alone, avoided by men who nevertheless relied on his deadly effectiveness. In the third week of October, Captain Andreev summoned him to the regimental command post, a reinforced basement beneath what had once been a school. The captain was a professional soldier, a man who'd survived the purges and the Finnish War through a combination of competence and political awareness. He looked at Reznov with an expression that mixed respect, necessity, and poorly concealed revulsion. "Your effectiveness is remarkable," Andreev said without preamble. 31 confirmed kills in 2 weeks. You've single-handedly paralyzed German reconnaissance operations in this entire sector. Reznov remained silent, waiting. However, the captain continued, "There are concerns about your methods, about your equipment." He gestured at the rifle Reznov carried, the amber lens catching the dim light of the oil lamps. "The men believe that scope is cursed. They believe it's affecting you, changing you. It's a German optic with an enhanced filter," Reznov said flatly. "It provides superior contrast in smoky conditions." "That's all, is it?" Andreev leaned forward. "Because the men also say you see things that aren't there, that you speak to empty air, that you know things you shouldn't know, that you can predict enemy movements with impossible accuracy. I'm a hunter, Captain. I read patterns. I understand how soldiers think and move. There's nothing supernatural about it." Andreev studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps, but I'm ordering you to stop using that scope. Turn it into supply. Use standard equipment." The words hung in the air between them. Reznov felt something cold settle in his chest. "The scope is why I'm effective. Take it away and I'm just another sniper. Then be just another sniper. Your effectiveness isn't worth destroying morale. The men are terrified of you. They think you've been corrupted by something, that whatever killed the first 3 men is now working through you. I can't have that kind of fear spreading through the ranks. The men are terrified because we're in Stalingrad, and Stalingrad is hell. Taking away the one tool that's been keeping Germans out of our positions isn't going to change that. That's not your decision to make, Sergeant. It's mine." Andreev's voice hardened. "Turn in the scope, or I'll have you arrested for insubordination and endangering morale. The NKVD doesn't look kindly on soldiers who spread panic, even if they do it unintentionally." The threat was clear. The NKVD, the internal security apparatus, had commissars attached to every unit, watching for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. A word from Andreev to the political officers, and Reznov could disappear, executed for crimes he didn't understand. His body dumped in the Volga with thousands of others. "Understood." "Captain," Reznov said quietly. He left the command post with the amber lens still mounted on his rifle. He walked through the ruins toward his current position, a partially collapsed factory building that provided excellent sight lines over a key intersection. He thought about following orders, about returning to conventional equipment, about becoming just another sniper in a city full of snipers. And then he thought about the Germans, massing for another push, preparing to overwhelm the exhausted Soviet defenders through sheer weight of numbers. He thought about how the amber lens was the only thing that let him engage them effectively in the smoke and chaos that defined every battle. He thought about orders that sounded reasonable in a basement command post, but that ignored the reality of combat, where men died because of doctrine that didn't account for actual conditions. His father's voice came to him across the years. The sin is not in killing, but in killing without purpose. What was the purpose of following an order that would get men killed? What was the purpose of abandoning a tool that worked because frightened soldiers needed someone to blame for their fear? Viktor Reznov made his decision. He would keep the amber lens. He would continue hunting. And if that meant disobeying orders, meant accepting whatever consequences came with that disobedience, then so be it. Some things were worth the price. He didn't know yet how high that price would become. The German assault came at dawn on October 26th, announced by the thunder of artillery that shook dust from the ruins and sent rats fleeing through the rubble. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. Systematic destruction of every building that might house Soviet defenders, shells walking across the landscape in precise patterns that spoke of careful targeting and abundant ammunition. When the guns finally fell silent, the German infantry advanced. Not the probing patrols and cautious reconnaissance of previous days, but a full-strength assault. Multiple companies moving in coordinated columns toward the factory district that housed the Soviet regiment's main defensive positions. This was the breakthrough attempt German commanders had been preparing for. The hammer blow intended to shatter the Soviet line and open a path to the Volga. Captain Andreev, watching from his command post as reports flooded in, understood immediately that his force couldn't hold. He had perhaps 400 effective combat troops, exhausted men with limited ammunition, facing what appeared to be more than 2,000 Germans supported by armor and artillery. The math was simple and brutal. His regiment would be overrun within hours. He gave the only order that made tactical sense. Fall back to secondary positions, conduct a fighting withdrawal across the Volga, under cover of darkness. Abandon the factory district, rather than waste lives defending ruins that couldn't be held. The order went out to all units at 07:20 hours. By 07:30, most squads had begun their retreat, moving back through prepared routes toward the river crossings. But one man didn't receive the order, because Viktor Reznov was already in position, and he had made his own decision about what came next. He'd chosen the cathedral, or what remained of it. The Church of the Ascension had been one of Stalingrad's architectural jewels, a 19th-century Orthodox cathedral with soaring domes and elaborate iconography. German bombs had reduced it to a skeletal framework. The domes collapsed, the walls shattered, nothing remaining but the basic structure and the bell tower that still rose improbably above the surrounding destruction. The bell tower provided something Reznov needed: height and concealment. From its upper level, he could observe the entire German approach route, and the tower's hollow interior, choked with debris and shadow, made it nearly impossible to identify specific firing positions from outside. He'd spent the previous night preparing the location, establishing multiple shooting positions, clearing sightlines, creating escape routes through the rubble below. Now, as gray light filtered through the smoke, and the distant sounds of German engines grew louder, he settled into the first position. He mounted his rifle carefully, the amber lens catching the dim light like a fragment of captured sunlight. He opened a box of ammunition, 40 rounds, and laid them out methodically within reach. He checked his sidearm, a Tokarev pistol with one spare magazine. He drank water from his canteen, ate a piece of stale bread, and waited. Through the amber lens, the world below him appeared in stark clarity despite the smoke. He watched the German formations advance, saw their tactical discipline, noted the positions of officers and communication specialists. He identified machine gun teams and mortar crews. He tracked the movement of 3 light tanks providing mobile fire support. This wasn't a hunt anymore. This was a choice. He could leave this position, follow orders, retreat with his unit, and live to fight another day. Or he could stay, use the amber lens to extract maximum casualties from the German assault, and very possibly die here in these ruins. He thought about his father, about forests and wolves, and the clean deaths of things that followed comprehensible patterns. He thought about the 3 men who died before he claimed the amber lens. He thought about how the lens had changed him, how he saw things differently now, patterns and predictions and flickering shapes at the edge of vision. He thought about the German reconnaissance teams that had stopped operating in his sector, about the fear his presence had created, about how sometimes one man in the right position could change the mathematics of battle. Viktor Reznov pressed his eye against the amber lens, found his first target and squeezed the trigger. The first kill was a German officer, a Hauptmann directing troop movements from beside one of the light tanks. He dropped without sound, and in the chaos of the advance it took precious seconds before anyone noticed. By then, Reznov had shifted position within the tower, firing from a different angle, and eliminated the radio operator who'd been trailing the officer. The second kill disrupted German communications. The third, a senior NCO organizing a machine gun emplacement, created confusion in the command structure. By the 5th kill, German officers had identified that they were taking sniper fire, but they couldn't determine the source. Shots seemed to come from different directions, from positions that should have been impossible given the angles and timing. Reznov moved constantly within the tower, using the prepared positions, firing 3 or 4 rounds before shifting to a new location. The amber lens let him track targets through smoke that would have blinded other shooters. He could see the Germans clearly, while remaining effectively invisible himself, a ghost in the ruins, dealing death from a position they couldn't pinpoint. The psychological effect was immediate. German soldiers began to hesitate, their advance slowing as men took cover, as officers shouted orders that went unheeded, as the precise choreography of the assault dissolved into cautious uncertainty. The tanks, lacking infantry support willing to advance through the invisible killer's field of fire, halted their progress and began firing blindly at buildings, hoping to suppress a threat they couldn't see. 2 hours into the engagement, Reznov had 17 confirmed kills. German forces, which should have swept through the factory district in minutes, had advanced barely 200 meters. Officers were shouting contradictory orders. Units were losing cohesion. The entire assault was stalling, not because of organized resistance, but because one man with superior optics had made forward movement seem suicidal. Radio intercepts, captured later, would show the growing panic in German communications. "We can't advance. The demon sniper is here. He sees through the smoke. He knows where we are. Every man who moves forward dies. We need to withdraw and call artillery." But German commanders, under pressure to deliver results to justify the resources committed to this offensive, refused to pull back. They ordered the assault to continue. They sent more men forward into the smoke. And Viktor Reznov, watching through his amber lens from the cathedral tower, continued killing them with methodical precision. By the 4th hour, something changed. Reznov began to notice effects that went beyond simple optical enhancement. Looking through the lens, he could see not just where Germans were, but where they would be. He watched patterns emerge in the chaos, predictive patterns that showed him movement before it happened. A soldier preparing to dash from one building to another would appear in his new position a heartbeat before he actually moved, giving Reznov time to adjust his aim with impossible accuracy. The shapes at the edge of his vision grew more distinct. Sometimes looking through the amber lens, he saw figures standing among the ruins, figures that didn't move like living soldiers, but that nevertheless seemed to watch the battle with terrible interest. When he shifted his gaze directly toward them, they would vanish, but their presence lingered at the periphery, observing, waiting. He heard voices now, clear and distinct despite the chaos of combat. German voices, speaking words he shouldn't understand but that nevertheless made sense. He heard officers giving orders in buildings he couldn't see. He heard soldiers speaking their last prayers. He heard something else underneath it all, a kind of whispering that seemed to come from the amber lens itself, as if the glass was speaking to him in a language older than words. The lens was growing warm against his eye, not hot enough to burn, not yet, but noticeably warm, as if it was generating its own heat, as if prolonged use was activating something within the treated glass. The amber glow seemed brighter now, more intense, casting golden light across his face that should have made him visible, but somehow didn't. By the 6th hour, Reznov had 19 confirmed kills. The German assault had completely stalled. Officers were calling for artillery to level the entire sector, preparing to simply destroy every building, rather than continue feeding men into the invisible killer's sights. The Germans were preparing to withdraw, to abandon this approach, to acknowledge that forward progress was impossible while the demon sniper held the cathedral. And then something broke inside Viktor Reznov. Looking through the amber lens, watching another German soldier die, he felt something fundamental shift in his perception. The world tilted. The boundaries between what was real and what the lens showed him began to dissolve. The flickering shapes at the edge of his vision moved forward into full sight, and he saw them clearly for the first time. They were soldiers. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Soviet and German both, standing among the ruins in uniforms from different eras, different wars, different centuries. They stood silent and watching, and he understood with terrible clarity that he was seeing the dead, all the dead who'd perished in these ruins. Drawn to this place by the amber lens and the violence it facilitated, they weren't threatening. They simply observed, witnesses to the latest chapter in an ancient story, the story of men killing each other over ground that didn't matter for reasons they barely understood. And as he looked at them through the amber lens, Viktor Reznov felt something break inside himself, some final barrier between the hunter he'd been and the thing he was becoming. The lens was no longer just showing him where targets were, it was showing him what he was. What he'd chosen to become, a dealer of death, efficient and pitiless, trading pieces of his humanity for tactical advantage, using a tool that extracted a price far higher than he'd understood when he first looked through it. He took his eye away from the scope. His right eye, the one he'd been pressing against the amber lens for 6 hours, burned with sudden pain. When he touched his face, his fingers came away bloody. The skin around his eye socket was blistered, chemically burned from prolonged contact with whatever compounds coated the lens. He looked through the lens one more time, and what he saw made him understand finally what had killed the first 3 men, what had driven Pavlov off that roof, what price the amber lens demanded from those who used it. He saw himself through the scope, saw his own future position, his own death waiting in the tower, and he understood that the lens showed not just where enemies would be, but where everyone would be, including the user. The lens had been showing him his own death from the moment he first looked through it. He'd been seeing his future corpse flickering at the edge of his vision all along. The curse wasn't German engineering, it was simply the truth. The lens showed you everything, including the cost of using it, and most men couldn't bear that knowledge. Soviet reinforcements found him unconscious in the tower 8 hours later, the shattered remains of the amber lens beside him. He'd smashed it deliberately, destroyed it with the butt of his rifle, ground the golden glass into powder so that no one else would be tempted to use it. The German assault had failed. 19 dead, dozens wounded, an entire offensive momentum broken by one man in a tower. By the time German forces regrouped for another attempt, Soviet reinforcements had arrived. The factory district held. The line didn't break. In the grand strategic calculus of Stalingrad, it was a minor engagement, barely worth mentioning in official histories. But for the men who would have died if the Germans had broken through, it meant everything. Viktor Reznov woke 3 days later in a field hospital on the eastern bank of the Volga. His right eye bandaged, pain radiating through his skull with every heartbeat. A doctor, an older man who'd seen too many ruined soldiers, examined him with professional detachment. "Chemical burns," the doctor said. "Severe corneal damage from prolonged exposure to some kind of toxin. You're lucky you didn't go completely blind. As it is, you've lost approximately 60% vision in that eye. You'll never shoot with that kind of precision again." Reznov nodded slowly. "I know. What were you exposed to?" "We need to know for treatment purposes." "German optical coating," Reznov said. "Some kind of experimental chemical treatment. The scope was damaged during the engagement. I don't know what was in it." The doctor made notes. "Well, whatever it was, it's permanently damaged the tissue. There's nothing we can do to reverse it. You're done as a sniper, Sergeant. I'll recommend reassignment to a support role." 2 days later, Captain Andreev visited. He stood beside Reznov's cot, looking down at the bandaged soldier with an expression that mixed anger, relief, and something close to respect. "You disobeyed orders," Andreev said without preamble. "You should face disciplinary action. Possibly a tribunal." "Yes, sir." "However," the captain continued, "your actions also saved approximately 300 men who would have died if the German assault had succeeded. The regiment held because you gave them time to reinforce positions. High Command is pleased." He paused. "You're being awarded the Order of the Red Star for exceptional courage in combat." Reznov said nothing. "The citation will mention your defense of the cathedral position and your confirmed kills. It won't mention the scope." Andreev's voice lowered. "I spoke with the men who found you. They said the lens was destroyed. Completely shattered. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Some weapons are too dangerous to exist, even if they work. Even if they save lives." He placed a hand on Reznov's shoulder. "You're being reassigned. Training command. Teaching new snipers. No more frontline service. Your war is over, Sergeant." After Andreev left, Reznov lay in silence, listening to the sounds of the hospital, the groans of wounded men, the distant rumble of artillery from across the river, where Stalingrad continued its slow death. He thought about the amber lens, about what it had shown him, about the price he'd paid for those 6 hours of perfect sight. Decades later, German intelligence documents captured and declassified would reveal a standing order issued on October 28, 1942. All German units operating in Stalingrad's factory district were instructed to avoid the cathedral area indefinitely. The reason cited was unexplained capability of enemy, forces to engage targets in zero visibility, conditions with impossible accuracy. The order noted that over 40 German soldiers had been killed or wounded by sniper fire from a single position over the course of 1 day, that the shooter had demonstrated supernatural perception, and that until the source of this capability could be identified and countered, the area should be considered compromised. The Germans never identified the source. They never captured the amber lens or analyzed its properties. They simply avoided that sector of ruins, treating it as cursed ground, a place where something had happened that didn't fit into their understanding of warfare. Viktor Reznov never spoke publicly about the amber lens or what he'd seen through it. He spent the remainder of the war training new snipers, passing on technical skills, teaching men how to read terrain and calculate distances and control their breathing. He never mentioned patterns that predicted movement, or shapes that watched from ruins, or the price that certain tools extracted from those who used them. When the war ended, he returned to the Ural Mountains. Not to his old village, but to a different one, smaller and more remote. He married a teacher, a quiet woman who asked few questions about where he'd been or what he'd done. They had 2 daughters. He worked as a carpenter, building homes and furniture, living a simple life far from cities and crowds. He never hunted again. His daughters would ask sometimes why he didn't go into the forests like other men. why he never carried a rifle when wolves took livestock from neighboring farms. He would tell them that he'd seen enough death, that other men could do that work now. He didn't tell them that sometimes, even decades later, when he closed his remaining good eye, he could still see the amber-tinted world of the lens, could still see shapes standing in empty rooms, watching him with patient interest. In 1989, 47 years after the Battle of Stalingrad, a memoir was published in Germany by a former Wehrmacht soldier named Klaus Hoffmann. In a chapter about his experiences in the city, he described what he called the Bernsteingeist, the Amber Ghost, a Soviet sniper who had haunted the ruins near the factory district. "We feared him not because he killed us," Hoffmann wrote, "but because he saw us when we believed we were invisible. He hunted in conditions that should have made accurate fire impossible. He killed from positions we couldn't locate. Men began to believe he could see through walls, through smoke, through darkness itself. That is the purest form of horror, to understand that you cannot hide, that something sees you always, that the darkness you depend on for protection has become transparent to your enemy." Hoffmann's memoir noted that German units eventually abandoned operations in that sector entirely, that they chose to leave that territory to Soviet forces rather than continue losing men to an enemy who possessed capabilities they couldn't explain or counter. Viktor Reznov died in 1991, 2 months before the Soviet Union itself dissolved. He was 75 years old. His funeral was attended by family and a few neighbors who knew him only as a quiet carpenter who kept to himself. No military honors, no mention of medals or service, just a brief ceremony and burial in the small cemetery overlooking the forests where he'd spent his final decades. Among his possessions, his daughters found a single photograph from the war, a grainy image of a young soldier holding a rifle. The image was faded, the details unclear, but if you looked closely at the scope mounted on the rifle, you could see a faint golden tint to the glass, like captured sunlight, like amber. In 2003, Russian military archives declassified documents related to experimental optical equipment recovered from German forces during the war. Historians discovered references to a specialized reconnaissance scope with an amber filter, believed to have been coated with compounds designed to enhance vision in smoky conditions. The documents noted that Soviet soldiers who used captured examples reported unusual side effects, visual hallucinations, paranoia, and in at least one case, severe chemical burns from prolonged exposure. The documents identified one soldier by name, Senior Sergeant V. Reznov, who had used such a scope to exceptional effect during the defense of Stalingrad's factory district in October 1942. The file noted 19 confirmed enemy kills in a single engagement, effectively halting a battalion-strength assault through superior observation and marksmanship. It also noted chemical injury resulting in permanent vision loss and recommended assignment to non-combat duties. The file contained one additional detail. Medical examination had revealed that the chemical compounds in the scope's coating included derivatives of methylene blue and other substances known to be toxic with prolonged exposure. The examination concluded that extended use of such optics would inevitably result in permanent damage. The scope itself had been destroyed in the field, and no samples remained for analysis. The amber lens had been exactly what Viktor Reznov believed it was, exceptional German engineering that provided genuine tactical advantages through chemical treatment of optical glass. It had also been exactly what the frightened soldiers believed it was, a cursed thing that extracted terrible prices from those who used it. Both things were true simultaneously. The lens showed you the enemy clearly and destroyed your ability to see. It saved lives and cost lives. It was just glass, and it was something more than glass. Perhaps that's what made Viktor Reznov's story so unsettling. Not that he'd used a supernatural weapon, but that he'd used a perfectly ordinary one and paid an extraordinary price. Not that the lens was cursed, but that all weapons carry curses built into their function, costs that accumulate in ways we only understand after we've already paid them. He saw the enemy when others couldn't. He saved hundreds of lives through that vision. And the seeing burned him, literally and metaphorically, taking his eye on something deeper, taking the hunter who'd once killed wolves with respect and turning him into something else, something that could kill 19 men in 6 hours and feel nothing, something that saw shapes in smoke and heard voices that weren't there. The amber lens didn't create a monster. It simply revealed what a man would become when survival required perfect sight, when effectiveness demanded sacrificing pieces of yourself you couldn't afford to lose. It showed Viktor Reznov what he needed to see and what he was becoming in the process of seeing it. Some say the lens was cursed. Others say it was simply too effective, that any tool that powerful inevitably destroys those who wield it. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps the real curse wasn't in the glass at all, but in the choice to keep looking through it, knowing what it cost, because men were dying and you were the only one who could see clearly enough to save them. Viktor Reznov looked. He paid the price. He broke the lens so no one else would face that choice, and in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the cathedral where he made his stand, locals will tell you that sometimes, on certain autumn mornings when the mist rolls in from the Volga, you can see a faint amber glow in the broken tower, like sunlight caught in glass that no longer exists, still watching, still waiting, still seeing what others cannot see.